Jeremy Rifkin, in your latest book, you predict that the third industrial revolution, creating the collaborative commons as a replacement for capitalism by, say, 2050. Can you just explain what the collaborative commons is?
Well, let me say that what we're beginning to glimpse, and it's just the bare outline, capitalism is giving birth to a new economic system, its progeny. And this is the sharing economy on the collaborative commons. And this is the first new economic system to emerge since capitalism and socialism in the early 19th century. So it's a pretty remarkable event, even though young. It's flourishing. The sharing economy and the collaborative commons is flourishing alongside the exchange economy in the capitalist market. By 2050, capitalism isn't going to disappear, but it's going to be totally transformed by having to nurture the child it gave birth to. Now it's going to have to learn to live with a child in two systems that complement each other, part capitalist market, part collaborative commons. The bottom line is the sharing economy and the collaborative commons is made possible by great economic transformation and technological transformation. Something called zero marginal cost, which people shouldn't be afraid of. It's not too difficult. Marginal cost in economics is the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service after you pay your fixed cost. What we're beginning to see is a paradox deeply embedded in the heart of capitalist theory that none of us ever saw. Adam Smith didn't see it early on, or Karl Marx, or Lord Keynes, or John Kenneth Galbraith for that matter. None of us saw it. But this paradox, it's kind of interesting, has what's led to the great triumph of the invisible hand of the market. Here's the paradox. The invisible hand is about to achieve its ultimate triumph. That triumph gives birth to a progeny, the sharing economy and the collaborative commons, and now capitalism is going to have to learn to live with its progeny.
But capitalism has a record in the past. You can go back to ancient Greek times, certainly to Roman times. Capitalism always seems to come out on top. And the thinking of the Chicago School of Economists, Milton Friedman and his students, they still believe that capitalism is the way, the free market is the way to run the world, and they will find a way to extract a profit from it, won't they?
Well, I think they will, but the question is to what extent. And maybe we can come back to that in a few minutes after we lay out the vision. Then I think it'll become a little bit more clear what role they'll play. Capitalism will be able to profit by helping to build, grow, and nurture these collaborative commons. But it's not going to be the primary arbiter of economic life by mid-century. It's going to have to share the stage with its progeny, for sure. Here's the paradox. In classical economic theory, we always encourage entrepreneurs to find new technologies that will increase their productivity, reduce their marginal cost, so they can put out cheaper goods and services and win over consumers and market share and bring some nice profits back to the investors. So we always encourage new productivity, reduction of marginal cost. And the optimum market in classical economic theory is where you sell at the marginal cost. Here's the rub. None of us ever expected, ever in our wildest imagination, a technology revolution so extreme in its productivity that it could actually reduce marginal costs for some, not all, but some goods and services to near zero, making them essentially free and abundant and beyond the market. That's beginning to happen on a massive scale, but let me provide context so people understand this and it makes common sense. All the great economic revolutions in history, the great economic paradigm shifts, share a common denominator. And there have not been that many great economic paradigm shifts throughout history. We had forager-hunter societies, early agricultural pastoral societies, hydraulic civilizations, predatory empires, feudal societies, early market economies, industrial capitalism. What's the common denominator to all of these paradigms? At one moment in time, three technology revolutions converge and create a new general purpose technology platform, a new infrastructure for organizing economic life. New forms of communication to more efficiently manage economic activity, new forms of energy to more efficiently power economic activity, new forms of transportation to more efficiently move economic activity. Common sense anthropologically, but never discussed by economists. When they come together, communication, energy, transport, they actually change the way we organize economic life. Let me give you two quick examples. First industrial revolution, 19th century. Second industrial revolution, 20th century. In the 19th century, steam-powered printing emerged. The fixed cost high, marginal cost low, and the telegraph. These communication technologies converged with cheap coal powered by steam engines and locomotives on national rail systems. And we went to industrial capitalism, changed history. It actually created a new form of government. It's called the national government to govern these territories that were so expansive. In the 20th century, we had another convergence of communication, energy, and transport, second industrial revolution. Centralized electricity, and particularly the telephone, later radio and television, converged with cheap oil, powered by internal combustion engines, and we moved to a transport system, cars, buses, and trucks, national road systems. That second industrial revolution took us well through the 20th century, and it peaked. It peaked in July 2008. I don't know if you remember that month, but oil hit $147 a barrel that month on world markets. Purchasing power shut down all over the world. Everything's pegged to fossil fuels. Everything. Construction materials, plastics, fertilizers, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, power, transport, heat, and light. So what's happening now is we are in an end game for the second industrial revolution. And the governments that I advise and the heads of state that I work with, they're all lamenting. They say, oh, the economy's slowing, GDP's slowing, productivity is slowing, unemployment's rising. And they say, what do we do? And I said, look, you have to understand, we are now in an end game for an entire technology platform of the 20th century. The fossil fuel energies and nuclear power are too expensive. And now they're creating, fossil fuels are giving us real-time climate change, impacting the economy on a dramatic level. The technologies based on those energies, like internal combustion engines and centralized electricity, have exhausted their S-curve. We can't get any productivity out of them. And the infrastructure itself is old and now is being patched up. So there is no way any country in the world can actually move out of the door and create economic growth as long as we're stuck in that 20th century platform.
The problem there, though, with energy is that there is still no international grid in Europe. There is no smart grid. There is no way of, if you like, evening out the irregularities that come from renewable fuels like wind and tidal power and so on, because where there's no wind or where the tide's running low, you don't get the energy. You need a grid, but there's national resistance to that. How do you overcome that?
Well, we're doing that now. Let me outline this third industrial revolution for you. Now, this is the formal plan of the EU. I was privileged to develop this for and with the EU over 13 years. It was endorsed by the Parliament in 2007, the European Commission in 2007. It's our 2020, 2030, and 2050 plan. So it's our plan. Germany's leading it. I've been advising the Chancellor since she came in office. They are ahead of the game. Denmark is too, and a few other countries. But here's where we stand. And I want to get directly to your question of intermittent energy as I lay out this scheme. We are beginning to move into a third industrial revolution. And this is hopeful. The communication internet, which we all use, is morphing. It's converging with a distributed renewable energy internet on a distributed smart grid. And that in turn is converging with a digitalized, automated, GPS-guided transport and logistics internet to create three internets in a super internet of things, one system. And these three internets, this super internet of things, are laying out sensors all across the value chain, billions of sensors, connecting agricultural fields and factories, retail stores, smart homes, vehicles, etc. And they're sending tremendous amounts of big data back to this emerging Internet of Things, communication, energy, and transport, Internet. And what this allows us, by the way, by 2030, 100 trillion sensors connecting every device and every human being. Now, what's exciting about it is the human race can now become a single human family and begin to engage in commerce and trade on an even playing field. The terrifying part of it is we're now having to deal in Brussels with privacy issues, data security, network neutrality, cyber terrorism, who's going to control the grid. It's a huge array of challenges that go with this exciting transition. But let's assume we can deal with these challenges for a moment. What this allows us, everyone that's listening to this interview, if you're connected to the internet, which is 3 billion people now, pretty soon the whole human race, any of us can go up on this Internet of Things as it's emerging right now, and we can begin to mine a sheath of the economic value chain that we're concerned with. The sheath could be our own neighborhood, or the value chain could be our own business or industry, or for a government, its own jurisdiction. And we can take that sheath of the value chain and watch all that big data in real time coming through the three internets, and we can use our own apps, our own analytics, create our own algorithms, and dramatically increase our productivity, reduce marginal cost, and begin to produce our own goods and services, many of them at near zero marginal cost, sharing them on a collaborative commons. That's actually beginning to happen in a massive way now.
But there is this, as you mentioned, the privacy issue. I mean, you're here to address the World Democracy Forum, and this is mainly about getting young people engaged in politics. Young people, of course, are far more savvy with the internet and with using the new electronic media, but they're also very vulnerable on it. We hear of people being targeted, we hear of grooming, we hear of radicalization, for instance, of young people, persuading them into crime. And indeed pornography, online pornography. There are all sorts of things. You say policing, yes, but who does the policing and how, and what sanctions do you apply?
I work with the European Union. I was just in Brussels, going back there again this week with the new leadership. And I was asked a month ago in Brussels to lay out this Digital Europe plan with the EU at our Digital Action Day, and we're really taking strides on the privacy issue, data security, network neutrality. Every day in the paper you read about a new challenge going on from the Commission. So that's happening. But let me concentrate on the democratic side, because we're talking about youth around the world who are the internet generation. They are the digital generation. How do they begin to come into their own and create a more democratic, sustainable, ecological society to live in? And let's assume we can address all these challenges. But what is the upside here? We always go to the downside and not yet get to the upside. We now have hundreds of millions of young people. And at any given time, anyone on the internet, which is 3 billion people, have become prosumers. At any given time, they've left the old category of seller, buyer, owner, and worker. They've democratized economic life. We have hundreds of millions of young people who are producing and sharing their own music at near zero marginal cost on the sharing economy in the commons, on the web, bypassing the music industry. They're producing and sharing their own YouTube videos near zero marginal cost on the sharing economy in the commons, bypassing television. They're producing and sharing their own news blogs, social media, bypassing newspapers and magazines, zero marginal cost on the commons. Even their own free ebooks, bypassing the publishing industry, and now massive open online college courses. So here's something that's extraordinary. Here's a forum on the democratization of life, and a young generation's already done it in the sense of in entertainment, news, knowledge, and media. Millions and hundreds of millions of them have begun to democratize these great industries, and some of the biggest vertically integrated industries of the 20th century have gone down in 14 years. The music business, newspapers, magazines, book publishing, television shrunk. This is a great leap forward in democratization. But the other industries thought they were safe. They thought, okay, the virtual world, zero marginal cost, where you can put anything on the internet, and whether you send it to one person or a billion people, it's the same cost, near zero. But this can't possibly go over the virtual wall to the physical world, because that's where the real economy is. Well, it's now breached that firewall. It's moved to the physical world, and that's what I'm saying in the new book, the Zero Marginal Cost Society. The Internet of Things allows the communication internet to converge with an energy internet and a transport and logistics internet. And this gets to your original question. So hundreds of millions of us can produce our own green electricity at near zero marginal cost, store it, share it, and send it across the smart grid. And hundreds of millions of us can produce and share our own transport, car sharing services on GPS guidance and soon driverless at near zero marginal cost. That's beginning to happen. Now, to get to your first question on the energy grid, here's the issue. Germany is the best test case to what the opportunities and challenges are. When the chancellor first came in, she asked me to come to Berlin in the first couple of weeks of her government to help her address the question of how to grow the German economy. I said, look, you're not going to do it as long as you're in a 20th century energy, transport, and communication grid. I laid out what I'm about to lay out with you. First night, she said, I want this for Germany. She's done it. Here we are 7 years later. I should say all three political parties in Germany have done it. The Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Greens. In Germany, we're 27% green electricity right now today. We're heading to 35% green electricity by 2020. And what's interesting is the fixed cost of solar and wind panels, the fixed cost of solar panels and wind turbines, it's plummeting on an exponential curve just like computer chips. A solar watt used to cost $68 to produce in the 70s. It's 66 cents today. It's going towards zero. But even before you pay those fixed costs, or right after you pay the fixed cost of that solar panel, wind turbine in Germany, guess what? That energy's free. The sun doesn't send a bill over Germany. Just keep that little solar panel clean. The wind doesn't send a bill over Germany. Just keep the wind turbine clean. The geothermal heat coming up from the ground, no bill, free. Just keep the geothermal heat pump clean. So Germany is making this great transition to nearly zero marginal cost, non-polluting free energy. Now, there are problems because the energy internet requires 5 pillars. Pillar 1, put in the feed-in tariff. Encourage early adopters. Germany did it. Millions of people producing energy. Pillar 2, convert all your buildings, homes, offices, and factories to micro power plants. Insulate them, get them efficient, turn them into power plants. Germany did it. Pillar 3, storage. They didn't do it quick enough. That's the 3rd pillar. These are intermittent energies. You have to store them because the sun isn't always shining, the wind blows at the wrong time. Now, in the next 6 months, they will put in storage. I'm in direct conversation.
That's difficult, though, isn't it?
I'm in conversation with Sigmar Gabriel, the vice chancellor. No, it isn't. It's scale up. They didn't scale it. You have to incentivize it for early adoption. There's hydrogen storage and flywheels, batteries, capacitors, water pumping. All that storage is there. Within the next 6 months, Germany's moving on Pillar 3. Pillar 4, Germany didn't put in the smart meters to digitalize the energy internet so you could deal with peak and base loads. They're now doing it. Pillar 5, they did pretty well on transport and logistics. So in the next 6 months, Germany will get over the hoop. The wholesale prices have plummeted. The retail prices are up because they're passing the feed-in tariff to the consumers. It's a hump for a year or so. Then they're going to have free energy across Germany in a few years. What country is going to compete with free energy across your entire value chain? So it's happening, and most interesting about Germany is who's producing this electricity. It brings a smile to me. EMBW, E.ON, Vattenfall, and RWE, these giant, huge, vertically integrated power companies that we thought were invincible 7 years ago. What happened to the music industry? Newspapers, magazines, book publishing, television, happened to them. It's millions of small players that are producing the electricity in their electricity co-ops, getting low interest loans, and these 4 companies are producing less than 7% of the energy. They're not in the game.
Even so, the cost of actually having solar panels put on your roof or a wind turbine put in your garden are still very, very high. And as far as smart meters are concerned, the Commission's own research looked for a cost-benefit analysis for countries, including Belgium, after all, where the headquarters of the Commission is. They got a negative result, and so they are not rolling out smart meters there.
Well, that's absurd. I don't know where those figures came from, but in the United States already, we have 40, 50 million meters already. I have them in my house. They're easily done. I don't know where that stat came from. I have an advanced meter. My power company brought it to me 2 years ago, installed it. We have tens of millions of them. And in China, which is quite interesting, and this was a surprise to me, when my last book came out there, The Third Industrial Revolution, it was endorsed by a gentleman named Wang Yan, who's now the vice premier, a 10-person central committee in charge of the economy. And then it was read by Premier Lee, the new premier, who said he's instructed the government to lay out this Third Industrial Revolution plan that we developed for Europe. And I was there last September. I was again there 2 weeks ago. I met with the vice premier. I met with the government agencies. And here's what they've done in China. If this can't be done, then both Germany and China must be in la-la land. China just announced, the first time I was there, 11 weeks after I came last year, the chairman of the National Grid announced an $82 billion 4-year startup commitment to lay out an energy internet starting this year across all of China. So millions and millions of Chinese people can produce their own solar and wind electricity, store it, send it back to the grid. So if Germany and China, there's some disconnect between the facts that you're hearing in Brussels.
Yeah, but it was the Commission's own research people who came up with this figure. They got 4 countries, only 4 out of 28.
Are not what? They're not commercially viable?
They were not cost effective. They cost more to put in.
That's absurd. There are hundreds of millions of meters already. In Italy, there are advanced meters across the entire country on the grid right now. Millions of them.
Yeah, some countries have gone ahead with it. It's happening in Britain, but the problem is all the standards in each of the EU countries are slightly different.
Well, that's a different thing. That's not.
China can do it across the whole country. The EU can't.
That's true. And what we have to do now with the new leadership at the Commission, and that's a good point, we have to begin to create codes, regulations, standards for interoperability across the EU, so we can create an integrated technological platform for an integrated single market. That's going to be the job of the new European Commission for sure. And that has to be our next step in this journey. But we shouldn't confuse that with the advanced meters themselves and the digitalization. That process is well underway in many countries. It's cost effective because the digitalization optimizes your efficiency and reduces your cost of moving energy.
There has been resistance, though, hasn't there? Australia, for instance, a lot of resistance in Australia and in some parts of the United States.
I would say the outliers here are the United States, Canada, and Australia, and it's really unfortunate. I'm particularly sad about the United States because we were the first country to move the communication internet, Silicon Valley. We did it. Then we stopped coal, and we went to shale gas in the U.S. and tar sands in Canada. Australia stayed in coal. But when we stopped coal, we lost the opportunity of converging a communication internet with a distributed renewable energy internet and a transport internet based on those energies that's automated and guided and GPS guided. So if we stay in the old energies, in that old platform, it's likely that the U.S., Canada, and Australia will be second or third tier countries in 30 years from now. I think California is totally with us, and they're a huge juggernaut. But if California can't move the rest of the country in time, and we stay another 10 years, which is only a decade, locked into the old energies, we will have created a new generation of natural gas-fired power plants that amortize over 30 years. So that'll really be a real game changer. I'm always hopeful because America can move quick once it gets the narrative, but we're not there right now.
The EU reckons that by 2020, 72% of all of the countries will have smart meters for electricity, but only 45% for gas. It's not coming on together.
Well, gas needs to move more. Look, gas is not the transit. Gas is not the future. Let me let everyone who's hearing this understand. Natural gas emits CO2, just like coal and just like oil. It's cleaner, but it's a CO2 emitter. And the United Nations just issued its final synthesis report, its 5th report yesterday, and the UN climate panel is saying we've got to get off all carbon fuels, all of it. We are now racing against a timeline that looks like it's been passed. And if we don't move the entire global economy off fossil fuels in the next half century, we have potential catastrophic changes which could imperil our ability to survive on this planet. So while there's discussion about natural gas, this is a very weak discussion. We've got to transform the whole economy. I wrote the Zero Marginal Cost Society because that is the plan here, allows us a business plan to dramatically increase our aggregate energy efficiency and productivity, put lots of people back to work and lots of businesses to lay out the infrastructure, and at the same time, it heads us to a near zero marginal cost society, which reduces our ecological footprint to the extreme. Let me give you a case in point. Let's take 3D printing. This is the new manufacturing part of the democratization of the economy. 3D printing, we've got several million young people now that are 3D printing their own products. It's info-factoring, not manufacturing. And these young kids are using open source software, no intellectual property protection. They're all sharing the software, so it's near zero marginal cost for that. Then for the filament, to create these new generation of manufactured products, they're using garbage. Recycled plastic, recycled metal, recycled paper around the neighborhood. So it's near zero marginal cost, and it's redistributed. And they melt down this garbage, these recycled materials, and they build up a product. And now they're starting to power their factories with their own solar panels off-grid, near zero marginal cost energy. And some of the fabrication labs in Europe are using electric vehicles to get their little 3D printed products either to the market or the commons, and they're running on renewable energy at near zero marginal cost. And now the first 3D printed vehicle has emerged. It's called the Strati. It's commercially produced this year. It's an Italian car. They can use redistributed materials. And finally, in 10 years from now, those vehicles that we use in our logistics internet to get those products to the market or the commons, they're going to be driverless. Within 10 years, driverless. So how do you begin to compete with that? We're talking about democratizing manufacturing. Within 10 years from now, every school in the world is going to have, kids are going to have little 3D printers along with their little iPhones within 10 years. And you're going to have a whole generation beginning to produce their own physical wear, just like their millennial parents produce their own virtual wear at near zero marginal cost. And they're going to be sharing lots of it on a commons for free with each other.
You say that's going to happen across the whole world, but in fact 3 billion people connected to the internet now, that's only half the human race.
Yeah.
There are an awful lot of places that are very remote, where transportation is bad because roads don't exist.
Yeah.
There are a lot of very, very poor people. And also, there are things like agriculture, for instance. How do you get zero costs into agriculture? Things like raw materials. A lot of the poorest countries in the world rely on them.
The United Nations has endorsed the plan that I've laid out. I worked with Conde Yankello when he was chairman of UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. He's now the head of UN Energy, directly under Ban Ki-moon. Why the UN endorse the plan? We think that this plan can move quicker in the developing world for interesting reasons, because the liability there is the asset. The liability is there's no infrastructure, as you say. We've got 20% of the human race that has no electricity, and another 20% has only a minimum access. That's also an opportunity, because we know that it's easier to build from scratch a virgin infrastructure across a region than it is to transform an old one to a new one. It's like an old home. You renovate an old home, it can take years and years and you spend a fortune. It's easy to build a new one from scratch. In rural India now and in sub-Saharan Africa, we have thousands of little startup companies in the last 24 months, most of them social entrepreneurial enterprises, and they're going into villages and wiring up the whole village with electricity for $2,000. $2,000. They're putting in solar panels, little smartphones, so you can power your smartphone with your panel, wiring up the village, putting in a battery in the storage, $2,000 a village. It's starting all over rural India now in sub-Saharan Africa. You're going to see microgrids coming together, distributed microgrids, within the next 20 years, very quickly in the developing world. Now, materials, you mentioned raw materials. To get an understanding of where we're shifting from rare earths and raw materials to redistributed materials, look at the automobile. The automobile is the primary monster that has gulped up so much of the Earth's resources: rubber, cement, glass, all the materials that go into the automobile. And there's 1 billion automobiles and buses and trucks on the road. They have taken a huge amount of the virgin materials of this planet. Now, what's interesting is the young people seem to don't want to own automobiles anymore. It's quite a change. Automobile ownership is grandma and grandpa. The whole millennial generation, I see you're smiling, the whole millennial generation, they want access to mobility, not car ownership. They're all car sharing. They're moving from ownership to access. It's not cool to own an automobile. It isn't even in their vocabulary.
Isn't that because we've got overcrowded cities, though, and overcrowded city roads, and very high prices for garaging?
That is one of the reasons. So we have millions of young people, though, that are car sharing because the Internet of Things makes it so convenient and cool. They go up on their little smartphone, connect to a website at near zero marginal cost, immediately connects them to the GPS logistics website. Within 90 seconds, someone who owns a car connects with you who have a car. You go to their destination, and you don't even pull out your wallet. It's all automatically paid. This is the Internet of Things. It's convenient, it's quick, and in dense urban areas, it works well. For every car that's shared, 15 cars are eliminated from production. Now let's go right to your issue of materials. You remember Larry Burns. He was the executive vice president at General Motors until about 5 years ago. Biggest car company in the world. So Larry's over at the University of Michigan. He did a study of Ann Arbor, middle-sized city. He said, we can eliminate 80% of the vehicles even in this not too dense urban area and still have the same mobility cheaper with car sharing. Now let's extrapolate Larry Burns' study. There's 1 billion cars, buses, and trucks on this planet, gulping up the material resources, not to include in the energy resources. His study suggests that in dense urban areas, we're going to eliminate 80% of those vehicles in the next generation, because I guarantee you, we're moving from ownership to access. In the next generation, within 25 years from now, car sharing will be the norm. Car ownership will be an anomaly. We're going to eliminate 80% of those vehicles. The other 20% of the vehicles in the world are going to be car shared. They're going to be electric and fuel cell. They're going to be operating on near zero marginal cost renewable energy. They're going to be 3D printed with redistributed materials, and they're going to be driverless in 10 or 15 years on a logistics internet. This takes our ecological footprint down dramatically. All the materials of the world, we're using redistributed materials, nearly free energy that's non-polluting, that's renewable. So these are big shifts forward, and I absolutely agree that there are lots of obstacles in the way. When you read my book, you start to see all the challenges in there, and at the end of the book you say, wow, this is going to be an uphill struggle. But keep focused on the hopeful part. We are beginning to democratize economic life. I mean the younger generation, the millennial generation. They're already beginning to democratize large parts of their lives, even though it hasn't been given a narrative or a frame.
What about agriculture? I mean, some of the poorer countries rely on agriculture. They rely on raw materials that are processed elsewhere. They're exporting minerals or something of that nature. They're heavy. They're things that you can't transport by internet. Indeed, even transporting water and power is quite expensive. How do you overcome an obstacle like that? That would seem to be a game breaker.
It is a big challenge. And what I say in the book is that agriculture is the wild card. And really the elephant in the room here is climate change. Let me deal with agriculture and then climate change. We have an agricultural system that is so dysfunctional and inefficient that if an engineer were really to take a look at it and say, my God, how could human beings have created something like this? First, let's look at the land. We have less and less arable land available for agriculture. And the land we're using, and this will surprise people, 40% of all that agricultural land that we're still using is feed grain for animals. 40%. Not food grain for humans, because it allows the rich to live high up on the food chain with a lot of meat diets fed by grain, and this is the most inefficient economic system we've ever devised. It makes automobiles look particularly good, because to get a pound of beef onto a cow, you know how much grain you have to feed that cow? The inefficiency is enormous. And according to the United Nations, as the wealthier move up the food chain, we're going to have 60% of the agricultural land in feed grain rather than food grain in 20 years from now. 40% left for everyone else for feed grain. Brings the prices up because the rich do not want to move down to a more vegetarian diet to save their fellow human being on the planet we live in. Secondly, our agricultural land is all based on chemical farming. Chemical farming, because the big chemical companies made a huge amount of money in the 20th century on moving those chemicals into the agricultural lands. Our fertilizers and pesticides are made out of fossil fuels. When that price goes up, the price for fertilizers and pesticides goes up, even for the poorest families that are farming. Third, we use a lot of equipment, mechanical equipment on the farm, and it's all being managed by fossil fuel energy. Fourth, we send our products sometimes to a market 10,000 miles away, so we make a grape in Chile, and then we send it all the way to the United States to eat. Think of the cost of the shipment, the packaging, the refrigeration that goes into this. It's enormous. And I think most people will be surprised to know that while buildings use the most energy and are the biggest contributor to global warming, number 2 is beef production and consumption and animal husbandry and agriculture. Number 3 is transport. Nobody seems to want to talk about number 2. Even Al Gore won't talk about it, and I highly respect his work because we're all afraid that people won't want to change their diet or won't want to be inconvenienced. That's the inconvenient truth. Finally, we need to have moved to a new type of agriculture, ecological-based agroculture. And we now have enough knowledge in the most sophisticated biological fields, especially ecology, we can learn how to begin to place our crops into land in ways that integrate them with the surrounding flora and fauna without having used pesticides and fertilizers. This is happening all over the world. The only reason it isn't happening faster, it takes 7 years to detoxify a farm, to get all the chemicals out before you can be certified. We need governments to incentivize that 7-year process of laying the ground fallow. Then you can get premium for sending your crops to market. So I've outlined what I think is a system that's making sense. It's starting to emerge, and it can begin to address this issue. However, climate change can change the whole equation. And what I think people do not understand is why climate change is so terrifying. It's never explained. Everyone thinks, is it getting hotter? Is it getting colder? That's not the point. Climate change changes the water cycles across the planet. That's what's so terrifying about what's happening. We're the watery planet. We go to other planets, no water, not interested. Our ecosystems have developed over millions of years based on the water regimes, the cycle of the Earth, the cloud systems. For every 1 degree, the temperature goes up on this Earth from industrial activity and CO2 emissions, methane, nitrous oxide. Every 1 degree, the temperature goes up. That atmosphere is sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat is forcing that concentrated precipitation up to the atmosphere. The result, the whole water cycle of the Earth is dramatically changing. More violent winter snows, more dramatic spring floods, more prolonged summer droughts, more category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes. Our ecosystems can't catch up to this complete shift in the water cycle. And so our scientists tell us we're now in the 6th extinction event.
But there are still politicians around and political parties who play down the risk of climate change, who say that it's all a saw in a teacup, it's all people worrying about nothing. They have vested interest perhaps in big oil and in coal, but they are playing it down because they don't see it, they say they don't see it happening, and yet they are gaining votes. How do you overcome that?
I think a younger generation, I think it's a generational shift to some extent. I think the energy companies in the United States have done a very good job in pouring television commercials on that we're energy independent, don't worry about climate change. The idea that there could be a conspiracy on this scale, that thousands and thousands of scientists from every National Academy of Science across every discipline over 30 years could all be in some giant conspiracy and no one's ever told about the conspiracy. This is absurd. It's denial on a massive scale. It frustrates me about my fellow human beings that we could be so unable to grasp the enormity of this moment. Take a look around. Look at what's happening to the water cycle. The extreme snows and the floods and the droughts and the typhoons and the hurricanes and the tsunamis. It's everywhere, and it's building up year by year. I don't worry too much about the energy companies because we now have an economic plan and all of the other industries are getting on board. To shift to a third industrial revolution is going to move the economy. It's always about infrastructure. You create new economic paradigms, you got to lay down the infrastructure. So as we shift into this third industrial revolution, we're going to be able to move the economies, put millions of people back to work, create new business opportunities, because we have to transform every country's energy grid from fossil fuel and nuclear to renewables. That's a huge job. Then we have to take the whole electricity grid of every country and move it from servo-mechanical to smart so that we can have a digitalized energy internet. Then we have to move the whole transport system from these old internal combustion engines to fuel cell and electric cars and put in GPS and driverless guidance. When you look at the infrastructure shifts, they will keep 2 generations engaged in employment and create business opportunities. The end result is a near zero marginal cost society. And this gets to climate change. The only metric that I know of to address climate change is a third industrial revolution Internet of Things infrastructure. Why? Zero marginal cost is the ultimate metric for reducing our ecological footprint. It means that we so optimize our aggregate energy efficiency that we actually minimize the use of the Earth's materials in making things. That's how we can make them for nearly free. We're minimizing the use of the Earth's materials, zero marginal cost. Then if what we do produce at zero marginal cost, our cars, our homes, our clothes, our tools, our toys, are shared on the sharing economy on the commons, so we redistribute them over and over again, we're using less of the Earth's materials. If we move to a digitalized energy internet, we're off carbon-based fuels in a generation, and this is nearly free energy. And if we move to a transport and logistics internet that allows us to eliminate 80% of the vehicles on Earth, and the other 20% can be shared and renewable, made out of distributed materials, we're there. If there's a plan B to what I've outlined in the Zero Marginal Cost Society, I've asked heads of state I work with, tell me what your plan B is. Stay in the 20th century, which is taking us to climate change and to massive unemployment and to economic dysfunctionality. I don't see there's an alternative to it.
Having said that, the internet and internet connections, the whole economic exchange of stocks and shares and derivatives and so on, was one of the things that led us towards 2008 and the great economic collapse, dealing in things like collateralized debt obligations, the Chicago Stock Exchange, where people hold stocks for microseconds along the way. Now we have a society where austerity is being imposed across an awful lot of countries to try to restore the problems in the economy. And you've got some people, like the top 10% earn 60% of the wages, the top 1% earn 20% of the wages, and it gets tighter. Half of that is to the top 0.1%. At the same time, you've got people on 0 hours contracts, people on extremely low wages, having part-time and unsatisfactory jobs, even people with good degrees stacking shelves in supermarkets. Something's wrong there.
What's wrong, and I spend the first 3 chapters in the new book on this. You know, my publishers say, who likes history? Well, those first 3 chapters are crucial, and I talk about the history of industrial capitalism. How did we get to the 1% and the 99%? I know that Thomas Piketty says it's about business people coverting with politicians to successfully pass tax laws that benefit they and their children. True, but to miss the larger point, and the larger point is you have to always look at the technology platforms that a society puts down, those platforms distribute whether the money goes upstairs or laterally scaled to everyone else. So in the first industrial revolution, when we laid down national telegraph systems and railroad systems across countries for communication, energy, and transport, and coal systems had to be distributed, these required massive amounts of capital for the first time in history. So we created a new institution called the Modern Stockholding Corporation. That's what moved the New York Stock Exchange, capitalizing railroads, telegraph systems, and getting the coal to market. And in order to pay back the financing for laying out these systems, that stockholding corporation was the best model. But then we had to create these giant vertically integrated enterprises that could put everything under one roof, from supply to demand, because those enterprises were the most efficient ways of creating economies of scale. Reduce the marginal cost, put out cheaper products, and then be able to provide that return to the investors. So that's how it all worked. Now, today, at the end of the second industrial revolution, we have about 500 vertically integrated corporations that control a lot of the revenue in the world. Now, it is true that some of the great largesse of the first and second industrial revolution was distributed. Why? Because people created trade unions and made sure that they got compensated for their production. And so it is true that all of us inside the industrial cocoon are far better off than our ancestors 300 years ago. But it's also true that in these giant vertically integrated enterprises, stretching alongside this communication, energy, transport grids we created, that more power went to the top of the pyramid, to those in charge of the businesses and their shareholders, all right? But it is also true that a lot of it went laterally, but not as much. So I think not to understand now that we have a situation where 500 or so Fortune 500 companies, basically 4 or 5 companies in each industry control those industries, that's the reality. However, that is not history. That's a moment in time. This Internet of Things platform for a third industrial revolution, it lateralizes economic activity. The actual technology itself is designed to be collaborative, distributed, open, transparent, and it favors lateral economies of scale. Millions of small people come together. Again, let's go back to Germany. Millions of small players came together in electricity cooperatives with low-interest loans from banks and put the panels on their roofs, the solar panels and wind turbines. No big deal, no government help. The loans were paid back. And they're producing the power, and it's literally power to the people in Germany now. So, you know, big power companies are probably the mainframe, if you will, of the maldistribution of wealth. Now, we have millions of people around the world producing their own green electricity at near zero marginal cost. In 10 years from now, tens of millions of people. 20 years from now, most of the human race will be producing their own green electricity near zero marginal cost, sharing it on a distributed energy internet. And that is the actual shift to power to the people and a more democratic economy. That, of course, is irreversible unless we have some catastrophic shift in nature we can't deal with, because the technology's there.
In the meantime, though, we still have a lot of people living perhaps in apartments, in high-rise apartments, somewhere in our big cities, scraping by, having great difficulty in even paying the rent because they're on such low wages. They're on these crazy 0 hours contracts where they can't work for anyone else, but there's no guarantee they'll get paid at all in one particular week.
That's true. And in the Zero Marginal Cost Society, I spent a lot of time on employment. Now, you know, I wrote a book called The End of Work. It was kind of a seminal book back in 1995, and I said we're heading to a more automated capitalist market. Now we know, 20 years later, that was pretty much in the cards. That's what's happening. We have automated factory work. Factory work is going to be almost totally gone in 20 years from now. We have automated factories right now. Workers trained up for white-collar jobs. Now we're automating the white-collar jobs, finance, insurance, retail's going virtual, etc. Then we said train up for knowledge jobs, and now the knowledge jobs are automating with artificial intelligence, analytics. We don't need all the lawyers and accountants and radiologists. So what's left? What I say in the book is in the short to midterm, there's a reprieve. One silver lining for 2 generations. We have one last surge of massive employment in every country in the world to lay out this sophisticated, intelligent Internet of Things platform, the communication internet, energy internet, transport internet. When we take each country's energies, their fossil fuel and nuclears, we're going to have to convert all of that to renewable energy. Now, to do that, we have to retrofit every building in every country because the buildings leak. The building codes have always been poor. So you can't put a solar panel on a building if it is inefficient and it leaks through the windows and the doors. Who's going to lay out all the insulation and do those buildings? Millions of semi-skilled and unskilled workers. The construction industry is going to stay busy for 40 years converting all that building stock. This isn't academic. I chair a global team of some of the biggest companies in the world. We are laying out this Internet of Things platforms in whole regions. Right now, we're doing all of northern France, Nord-Calais, the entire industrial region of France. This isn't academic. But you have to retrofit the buildings, then you have to install the technologies. Secondly, imagine changing the entire electricity grid of every country, from servo-mechanical to smart and digital. Who's going to put in all the underground cable? Robots aren't going to do that. Millions of workers. Who's going to put in the sophisticated electronic guidance system for an energy internet? ICT companies, electricity transmission, telecom companies, electronics industry. Then the transport industry. How do we move from internal combustion engines to fuel cell electric vehicles? There has to be power plugs in every parking space so your vehicle can plug back in, get power from the energy internet, or take power out. Who's going to put in those power plugs? Millions of people, semi-skilled and skilled. Who's going to lay out this transport and logistics internet, all the sensors on the smart roads? Millions of semi-skilled, skilled workers. Then you're going to need professional skills in the transport and logistics internet to lay out a smart, driverless, GPS-guided transport system across the whole countries. So there's 40 years of a huge amount of potential jobs and employment to get there. And when people say, where's the money, that's the most amusing part of this. It's almost sad. In the EU, I just did a memorandum for the European Union, the new leadership. They asked, where's the money? Show me the money. I show them the money. There's 740 billion euros last year spent in the EU, last year, on new investment in infrastructure. That's almost $1 trillion US. That's in 1 year. It went into new old. In other words, they're pouring all that money, nearly $1 trillion, into shoring up a 20th century communication, energy, and transport infrastructure that's moribund, no productivity left, exhausted. If they only spent 25% of that money and earmarked it to laying out this new Internet of Things platform for a third industrial revolution, we could put people back to work, engage industries, labor intensivity, and get this job done.
Having spoken to people from the European Parliament who negotiated the Energy Conservation Directive that went through a couple of years ago now, they were saying that the main objectors were Mrs. Merkel and David Cameron of the UK, because it imposed rules on individuals, and they seem to be great believers in individual rights and freedoms and so on, and saving their companies' money and their government's money.
Well, I think Germany's done a stellar job. I think Denmark's done a very good job. Other countries are joining. In Germany, we are making the transition now over the next 6 months. The Vice Chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, is a friend. I've been in direct communication with him. He's in charge of the energy transition. We're going to put, the storage is going to be put in. The energies are moving really much quicker than we thought toward renewables. The wholesale prices are plummeting. We're going to have a little bit of a hump on retail prices till we get over that. This is happening. What's missing, this is crucial, again, the interoperability, the codes, regulations, and standards, so we can create a single integrated technology platform. Then we'll have a single market. So the job of the next commission is to do that. And the new commission now is concentrating on digital, the digitalization of Europe. And as I say, I just developed a memorandum for the new commission on this. How do we digitalize communication, energy, and transport and create that open, transparent, interoperable system? It's the digitalization that moves us to near zero marginal cost. To digitalize communication, we meant to near zero marginal cost. You and I can produce and share information almost for nothing. When we digitalize renewable energy, same thing. We'll be able to move to near zero marginal cost for renewable energies. Digitalize transport and logistics, we'll do the same thing there. So the key is the digitalization. And I was pleased that last week I saw Harvard Business Review did a cover story on the Internet of Things platform last week, and they finally came around, the Harvard guys, I teach at Wharton at the executive ed, and they said, what's the secret to this great productivity leap that's going to change the world? They did a box. They said near zero marginal cost. When we can digitalize across these fields, communication, energy, and transport, it allows us to go to near zero marginal cost. That's the ultimately efficient, extreme productivity society.
But then how do capitalist companies actually make their money?
I think they make money in various ways. Let me give you an example. Facebook, Twitter, and Google, these are capitalist companies. They made a tremendous amount of money by establishing these commons, these digital commons. This allowed hundreds of millions of the rest of us, especially young people, to begin to produce and share virtual products and entertainment and news and knowledge at near zero marginal cost. Other industries were disrupted by that. The music industry, television, newspapers, magazines, book publishing shrunk. Google, Facebook, and Twitter became very wealthy. What we're going to be seeing is that the capitalist enterprises that are successful will either be those who've transformed or new ones that start up, and it's the ones that are going to be able to find value in helping to grow and nurture the child, which is the sharing economy and the commons. Who will be the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Googles, and the Facebooks of energy? Will it be the electricity transmission companies erecting the energy internet? Or maybe ICT? Or maybe telecom? Or maybe electronics? There's going to be a scramble. Who will establish the transport and logistics GPS-guided driverless internet? Will it be the transport industry, logistics companies, maybe ICT? Since my book came out last spring, the English edition, there are meetings going on in boardrooms all over the world right now. And they're scrambling to figure out how they reposition themselves to be able to play a role in helping to nurture this new economic system. But the irony is, as they nurture this system, a lot of commerce and trade that had high margins in the market will go to near zero marginal cost and move to the commons. So it's a system where it's relentless zero marginal cost. You have to be in the game, but there's a realization when capitalist companies are in the game, some will benefit, others will not. But we're moving to a dual system. And frankly, a generation growing up that are prosumers, they need less income. If you're producing and sharing your own virtual goods, you're not buying the CDs. You're not
still got to buy food.
You're
still got to pay rent.
Absolutely, and I covered that. And that's why you still have to have jobs, and that's why we're going to put 2 generations to work creating that infrastructure. Now, here's the long run. In the short to midterm, 40 years, we can put everyone in every country to work to lay out this infrastructure. In the long run, this Internet of Things platform is smart. That's why we call it Smart City, Smart Planet. And so it can work on its own algorithms, its own analytics. It needs a small supervisory workforce. So once we have the labor intensivity to lay it all out, in 40 years, we're going to have a very automated capitalist market with very small workforces. We know that's coming, unless you say no to all the technology. The only way to stop this is to outlaw the solar panels, the wind turbines, the geothermal heat pumps, the 3D printers, the iPhones. It isn't going to happen. So in the long run, what do? We're already seeing a massive migration of employment. It's moving from the automated capitalist market to the social economy. The social economy is a huge sector ignored by economists who think there's only the market and government, or some form of the government social market economy. There's a third sector out there. It is massive. It's been there. It predates industrial capitalism. It's where millions of people willingly produce and share things for each other. It's where you create social capital. It's nonprofit education, healthcare clinics, daycare centers, senior citizens' homes. It's environmental groups. It's culture. It's sports. It's arts. It's over and over. There's so many things that we engage in where we pay fees for services. But they require humans interacting with humans. It's the cultural capital of civilization. So if you take a look now in the last 20 years at the studies, this social economy, it's not all nonprofit, cooperatives, et cetera. This social economy has been growing at 42% revenue. GDP is growing at 16% revenue. Yeah. And the employment, same thing. The employment in this sector is growing much quicker. In the US, Canada, and the UK, it's already 10% of the employment is fees for services paid. In parts of Europe, it's 15%. So we're not running out of things for human beings to do. Everybody's so frightened. We're not going to outlaw automation. So what we need to do is first lay down the infrastructure, put 2 generations back to work for 40 years, from semi-skilled to conceptual work. Then at the same time, rethink our educational institutions so we prepare our young people both for the smaller opportunities in the automated market and the much more expansive opportunities in creating social capital in the social economy. And that's a higher calling. You know, I hope our grandchildren, I suspect our grandchildren will look back at us with the same set of wonderment as we look back at slavery and serfdom. They're going to say, gee, my grandfather spent all day long driving a vehicle back and forth across the same road. My grandmother spent the whole day long in a department store checking out merchandise and with credit cards, wasting her life. Because hopefully our great-grandchildren are going to live in a more automated world. Conflict will not end. I'm not a utopian. I think that human beings, it's a tough living on this planet. Being alive is tough, but it's a better journey. It allows us to use our mind more creatively. It can get us to a more ecological civilization. And for the young people, how about democratizing economic life?
You mentioned the cultural aspects. If you look at something like, for instance, the Arab Spring, it was largely electronics driven. It was people using the internet, using emails and so on to get in touch with each other. And yet, the democracy that many people hope for in the West didn't develop in all of those countries. And in some of them, there are still big problems. There are cultural differences between countries that are hard to overcome, aren't there?
There is. And that's why this last book I did is part of a 3-book series. It started with a book called The Empathic Civilization, which is re-looking at the human narrative and how we evolve our consciousness over history to set on a philosophical and social context. The second book was The Third Industrial Revolution, which laid out a broad vision. The third book is the Zero Marginal Cost Society, which helps us take a look at how we can actually lay out an Internet of Things platform, the actual architecture for this. Now, having said that, we have all forms of historical consciousness still struggling on this planet. And when new forms of consciousness emerge, it throws into almost high gear all the old forms of consciousness. They're threatened by the new identities. So on the one hand, we have a younger generation, very cosmopolitan, like in the Arab Spring. They're up on the internet. They're Skyping on global classrooms. They're engaged in gossiping on Twitter. They see themselves as a part of a human family on Facebook. And they're connected and they're becoming more attuned to biosphere consciousness. They see the biosphere as their community.
But all the people who are joining ISIS?
Well, I'm getting there. On the other hand, we still have tribal blood wars from the earliest consciousness of history where people are fighting along tribal bloodlines. We still have people fighting fundamentalist religious wars from our theological consciousness era. We still have people fighting ideological wars from our early geopolitical era. So all of these former consciousness, they still exist on the planet, while a younger generation growing up on the internet, the digitalized generation, is trying to move us to some kind of a global biosphere frame of reference. It is a huge struggle. And what happens is, as the younger generation tries to move forward, all these old consciousnesses rear up because their identities are threatened, and they want to backtrack. That's there. That's a huge struggle. But barring catastrophe, which could happen, we have demographics on the side of the younger and younger generations. The studies over the last 30 years show that each younger generation is becoming less xenophobic, more open to human rights, more engaged with their fellow human beings, more cosmopolitan in their views. To say this isn't a struggle, though, would be naive. That's why I disagree with futurists who are just technology utopians. We have technologies, but that doesn't mean we'll get there unless we can change consciousness. Let me say why I'm guardedly hopeful. Let me give you 2 examples. One is toys. I know this sounds a little silly. You know, commercial toys were invented in Ravensburg, Germany, back in the 1600s, beginning of the market economy. Traditionally, a parent will bring home a toy, and they'll say to their child, their 4-year-old little girl, "We bought this at the store. We're now giving you your first toy. This is not your brother's toy. It's not your sister's toy. It's your toy. You're responsible for it. Take care of it." This child is learning their first introduction to property exchange in a capitalist market. They're learning, not my brother and sister's toy. Wow, that means I've got something special. Power, status, possession, all right? And so they're getting ready for the traditional capitalist market. What's happened now in my country in the last few years is a millennial generation of young parents, they're going up on these toy websites where there are thousands and thousands of shared toys by age category. The young parents pay a one-time subscription fee, which gives them a credit. They can download toys and have them shipped by category, by age group. Now, in 10 years from now, those toys are going to be sent to the homes in drones or in driverless vehicles running on renewable energy, 3D printed vehicles at near zero marginal cost. But right now, the parents are bringing the toys home. This is happening all over America and starting in Europe and Asia. And they're introducing a toy to their 4-year-old girl, and they're saying, this toy, another little girl enjoyed this toy, brought pleasure to her. She had a smile on her face. She loved this toy. And she took really good care of it because she knew one day you would want to play with this toy. And so the child learns now the toy is not a possession to defend. It's not a piece of property. It's not status. It's not exclusion. A toy is access to an experience for a moment of time, and the child learns that they have to take care of the toy because other child wants to use that toy in the future. They're learning to become prepared for a sharing economy.
Do you really think that's going to happen, though? I mean, children are very selfish.
Well, but I hate
so
to say,
so
you
are
and I
adults.
are old folks. Okay, I'm a lot older than you. But Nielsen just did a survey. Nielsen, the big survey. They just did the biggest survey ever done on the sharing economy, on the commons, across the world. It's massive already. And what they found is it's moving much quicker than we ever expected. And in Europe and America, over half of the respondents said they've either already shared or they are enthusiastic about either having other assets they share or vice versa, 54%. The Asia Pacific countries are even higher, much higher. And guess which country comes in number one on the sharing economy at 94%, saying they would share their assets with others? China. China, the emerging nations. So this is happening. This isn't, this idea that we are by nature selfish, this is, I must say, goes back to the Anglo-American Enlightenment. Our philosophers have said each little baby is born to be an autonomous agent that seeks their own self-material interests and doesn't give a damn about anybody else, but in pursuing their self-interest it promotes society. Very much an English and an American tradition, I must say, in the Enlightenment. Well, the fact is, that's not what history's been about. In the new book, Zero Marginal Cost Society, I take a look at the whole history of the commons. We have had a democratically managed institutions in local communities all over the world for 1,000 years, predating industrial capitalism, where people came together democratically, self-managed their commons, shared their resources, were innovative and creative, punished wrongdoers, expelled them if they didn't go along, and those commons are viable. It took an economist, Eleanor Holstrom, to write a book on this history because it had been left out of the history books. She won the Nobel Prize. The only economist woman ever to win the Nobel Prize just passed away. So a lot of our history doesn't exist before Adam Smith came along and said that we're each little autonomous agents pursuing our self-interest. The fact is, most of history, we are the most social creature. We live by companionship. We live by being part of a community. Ostracization is the worst thing that can happen to someone. So what we need to do is take that basic part of our social character and make it high-tech. Not go back to the quaint commons of yore, but move to a high-tech world where we can share this planet.
Well, what about the young people, for instance, who are volunteering to go and fight with ISIS in Syria and Iraq? And there are thousands of them, thousands of Europeans and a few Americans.
There are.
And they're attracted by the idea of killing people who don't share their views.
But let's not blow this out of proportion. A percentage of each generation literally are sociopathic. There's been a lot of studies on it. We don't know if it's by birth or early parenting or some combination of two, who are sociopathic. And then there are some who are just ideologically bent this way, or they're radicalized. But it's a small percentage of the human race that's rushing over to the Middle East. It isn't hordes and hordes of people like the Crusades crossing borders. Having said that, the reason I'm guardedly hopeful is as I've traveled, I see a younger generation in their teens who have moved from a geopolitical ideological frame of reference to what I would call biosphere consciousness. A biosphere is a scientific term. It's a sheath from the stratosphere to the oceans. It's 40 miles, where all living creatures interact with the chemistry of the planet to maintain this bizarre thing called life on Earth. We have teenagers coming home, and this is in the developing world too, middle class and the developed world. And they're saying to their parents, why do we use so much water? We're wasting the water. Why is the television on? No one's using that electricity. Why do we have two cars? Can't we car share one? Or the one I particularly like, apropos to agriculture, we have lots of young people coming home and asking their parents, where did this piece of beef come from on my plate? Did it come from a rainforest? Did they have to chop down those trees in the Amazon for 2 inches of topsoil for 3 years to graze the cow? And the kids are connecting the dots. They know that those trees harbor rare species of animal and plant life, and if the trees are knocked down, those plant and animal species die off. And they also know if the trees are knocked down, destroyed, to graze the cow from the burger, that the trees can't be a sink to absorb CO2 from industrial climate change, and the temperature of the planet goes up. And the kids connect the dots, and they know if the temperature of the planet goes up, some farmer can't feed her kids because their land is being flooded and then fixed with drought every summer. These kids are learning biosphere consciousness. They're learning ecological footprint. Your generation and mine, we never even, that would have been an alien concept. They are understanding that everything we do has an ecological footprint that affects the well-being of every other human, every other creature, every other ecosystem that we inhabit together, that we are immeasurably enmeshed and embedded in a life support system where there's no escape, no autonomy. Our well-being depends on the well-being of the rest of the biosphere. This is biosphere consciousness. Now, will we get there in time? Don't know. Can we find 3 generations committed and mindful to the task of saving the planet? Don't know. What I do know is the technology is now there, and the economic vision and game plan to introduce that technological revolution is there, and the possibility is there to employ the human race, move our businesses, create extreme productivity, optimize energy efficiency, get to zero marginal cost, and hopefully re-heal the planet. But there are so many obstacles in the way that we're going to have some good luck, and we're going to have to depend on the human race at one moment at a time to get it together and do the right thing.
I was just thinking about the cultural differences, though, might actually get in the way of the Airbnb working. For instance, in a place like Egypt, the conflict of cultures between people from the West and the likely hosts in an Arab country like Egypt, that might present difficulties, might it not?
Well, it does. What's amazed me about Airbnb and car sharing, the others, is how well it's worked. I mean, as an older generation, I would say when millions of people started to share their apartments and couch surfing, which was free, or Airbnb, which you paid, I said, this isn't going to work. But the amount of problems they've had are minuscule in terms of people being hurt or injured or somehow taken advantage of, minuscule. One of the reasons is that a younger generation is creating its own governance on the internet and now the Internet of Things. They have reputation sites. For our generation, it was your credit rating. Credit rating goes, you're out of the system. I mean, it was a big deal. For the younger generation on the internet and Internet of Things, they have reputation sites. You're judged. So if you give your home up for someone to share, or you are a host, or you're the person using the home, both are ranked each time. How congenial, were they clean and efficient, were they a good host or a good guest, etc. And if you lose points on your reputation site, like any commons, you can be expelled from the system. This is happening with sharing cars, sharing homes, sharing clothes, everything else. So these young people, not knowing the history of the commons all over the world, have come up with the same set of principles for democratic management, including who's in the system, how you judge each other's performance, what the protocols are, the punishments, the sanctions, and the expulsion. These are age-old principles that have governed commons for a long time.
How confident are you that capitalism won't hijack this new revolution and make money out of it to the detriment of its completion?
I think that that's a big struggle, and I spend a lot of time in the new book on this, in the Zero Marginal Cost Society. What I'm concerned about is network neutrality. What made the internet so powerful, it was network neutral. Anybody could have open access, no one was discriminated against. But now the telecom companies, the cable companies, the power companies, and some of the internet companies are saying, well, we want to use the data, we like to charge different prices. I'm not so worried about the telecom, cable, and power companies. When I saw the recording industry, the music industry tried to stop young people from sharing music. They tried encryption, criminalization, legal suits. It just didn't work. When millions of people had the technology to share it, they did it. I saw that the big power companies in Germany were powerless. Those big 4 power companies, when millions of people got low interest loans from the banks, started to create their own energy. It really wiped out the power companies as power generators. They're still going to service the energy internet, and they'll have a mission to perform. I'm more concerned about the internet companies. I love Google. I love the magic box. I love Google. I don't use Facebook and Twitter very much. But these companies have been successful by setting up a commons that allows millions of us to produce and share all sorts of things at zero marginal cost on the commons, sharing. But it's disrupted other industries, but now these companies have become very wealthy. The question is, do they get to the point where they're a global monopoly, where they can use our data, our creative content, in ways that we don't like for commercial advantage with third parties? We're now reaching that point in the discussion. So the love affair has now moved into a social and political process. And I suspect that at the EU level, we're going to be dealing, we already are dealing with this question of are these public goods? When an operation like Google or Facebook or Twitter has something we all need, there's no alternative, it's a public good. So what did we do with public goods in the 20th century? We all needed the electricity, the natural gas pipelines, and the telephones. So we allowed those companies that became successful to stay in the market, keep private. But we regulated them in terms of their price, transparency, engagement, and openness. It worked. So I have no problems with keeping these companies in the private marketplace. They've been successful. Let them continue. But I have no doubt that at the EE level and the global level, there's going to be global authorities. We will regulate these internet companies in terms of price, transparency, network neutrality, privacy of data, and guaranteeing our creative content. To believe that won't happen is naive. The whole human race is going to be connected to the Internet of Things. Does anyone think the whole human race is going to remain silent from here until the end of history and allow a few companies to dominate this? It defies history. People always respond. When millions of workers were undermined by the early factory owners and beleaguered and beggared, they organized trade unions to get fair compensation for, quote, their creative content, their physical labor. This is going to happen again. How long do you think it's going to take for a younger generation to put together a Bill of Rights? It's already being done, a digital Bill of Rights, and put it up on the internet for everyone to sign. You know, Psy, the performance dancer in Korea, Gong Dong Dance, that young man brought 1 billion people to his website in 2 months at near zero marginal cost. How long do you think it's going to take for the young millennial generation to put together a website for nearly free and ask 1 billion young people to sign up on a digital Bill of Rights to guarantee their creativity, their content, their data security and privacy? Then they're sitting across from Google, Facebook, Twitter, Alibaba, and Tencent. What are they going to say? No, because they live on the reputation they built by creating this commons. The commons is ours, though, to govern. So we're going to have an esprit de corps, a collegiality. There's going to have to be an agreement here. I'm hopeful enough that I know that will happen. I've been an activist for 45 years. I know that that's going to happen.
Jeremy Rifkin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.